Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Oded Galor, who is a professor of economics at Brown University, also the author of a number of books. The most recent book is called The Journey of Humanity, The Origins of Wealth and Inequality. Also, another book called Universal Growth Theory. Welcome, Oded.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be on your talk show.
Well, listen, I think at the end of this book, you said that for as long as humans have been self-reflecting, they have been thinking about issues of wealth and inequality. And I think that's certainly been true for me. I've spent a big chunk of my career thinking seriously about the origins of wealth and inequality. And as my training as an economic historian has led me to focus on why it is that we've had this big discontinuity, right? This big escape from what you call the Malthusian trap, or a lot of people call it the Malthusian trap. And, a lot of people have taken various approaches to this, and you are leaning, I think, on dynamic systems, on complexity theory, on positive feedback. You bring in issues of population, you bring in issues of culture and institutions. And, I guess if we were to reflect on what people get wrong, because if you misunderstand the causes, then you'll also advise futile policies, right? So it's important to understand the causation if you want to have good policies. What is it that people fundamentally get wrong about their understanding of the escape from Malthusian trap?
Right. So the viewpoint that I advance in my recent book, The Journey of Humanity, is that much of the inequality as we see it across the globe today is originated in forces that operated in the distant past, forces that were formed hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and even tens of thousands of years ago. And consequently, attempts to understand the roots of inequality in the context of neoclassical growth models that are predicated on the existence of economies within the modern growth regime are bound to fail. In the sense that if we look at inequality, say about 200 years ago, the difference in income per capita between the richest regions of the world and the poorest one, it is of a ratio of about 3-1. And then, in the course of this incredible transition from stagnation to growth, we see this incredible spike in living standards. Living standards in the world as a whole is increasing by a factor of 14. And accompanied this is basically an incredible divergence in the wealth of nations. So to a large extent, the main argument of unified growth theory that I advanced in the past few decades is that in order to understand inequality today, we have to understand the link between the operations of societies today and their initial conditions in the distant past. Namely, it is the Malthusian epoch, the epoch of stagnation, that will be critical for the understanding of the timing of the transition, the differential timing across the globe, and the emergence of inequality. So to a large extent, I'm arguing that during this period of stagnation, there is a fascinating dualism. During this Malthusian epoch, income per capita is stagnating over a long period of time. Life expectancy is hardly changing and is fluctuating in a very narrow band of 25 to 40. But nevertheless, there is certain dynamism in the context of the scale of the human population, dynamism in the context of the adaptation of the human population, and dynamism in technology that ultimately brings about a phase transition and much of the inequality as we see it across the globe today. And consequently, in order to understand the roots of inequality today, we have to develop theories that will enable us to link the present and the past. Namely, we have to focus on those initial conditions that created the precondition for economic development and ultimately created much of the inequality as we see today.
Right. Well, sometimes we focus on the discontinuity associated with the Industrial Revolution, which would locate this great leap in Western Europe. But you point even further backwards to the Neolithic Revolution, right? The Agricultural Revolution, which happened in the Fertile Crescent. And so one big mystery is, why is it that the leap that was taken in agriculture in that location did not lead to the Industrial Revolution in, say, Mesopotamia, right? Why wasn't that? Why weren't the conditions that made that first revolution possible the same conditions that made that second one possible?
Indeed. So one of the main mysteries that I try to resolve in the context of the journey of humanity and context of unified growth theory is what I defined as the mystery of growth, namely what brought about this dramatic transformation in living standards that occurred in the past 200 years after 300,000 years of stagnation since the emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa. And what I conclude is that to a large extent, there are certain forces, as I said before, that percolated over the course of human history and matured only in the eve of the Industrial Revolution. So indeed, when humanity is transition into the Neolithic, transition from into sedentary agricultural communities, there is a great surplus that is being generated. But nevertheless, this improvement or temporary improvement in living standards is not long lasting because it results in proportional increases in population and technology, and ultimately income per capita remains unchanged. And it is only in the course of the Industrial Revolution, when the pace of technological progress becomes so rapid, there is a new demand, a demand for a new type of human input, which is human capital, that is basically changing the dynamics and permitting sustained economic growth to take place. So again, over the course of human history, we see this interaction between the scale of the human population, the adaptation of the human population, and technological progress. Technology is advancing, and as a result of it, people have more resources than before. Actually, income per capita increases temporarily. But this increase in income per capita is permitting family sizes to get larger. Child mortality declines, child fertility increases, and as a result of it, population growth increases. And ultimately, the increase in the size of the human population offset entirely the gains that were made due to technological progress. But nevertheless, this larger scale of the human population would imply that this next wave of innovations will be even more pronounced and will occur more rapidly. But again, the next wave of innovation, say the Neolithic Revolution, is again resulting in a larger population with no change in income per capita. And then we see this positive feedback loop. We see this reinforcing interaction between population and technology. And in the course of this interaction, the pace of technological progress increases, becomes more and more rapid, up to a point in which the environment, the technological environment is changing so rapidly so as to demand human capital, so as to demand education that will permit individuals to navigate this rapidly changing technological environment. And it is at this juncture in which responsible parents are starting to invest in the education of their children that we see the emergence of sustained economic growth. And the reason is that naturally parents are too poor to invest in the education of their children and to maintain their family sizes. And consequently, this investment in education that becomes essential in order to cope with this rapidly changing technological environment is coming on the account of the family size, is coming on the account of the number of children. Fertility starts to decline, the population growth starts to decline, and as a result of it, for the first time in human history, we see that technological progress is no longer being counterbalanced by population growth, and the growth process is starting to take place.
Now, we've only been experiencing this industrial revolution for maybe 250, 300 years. And I would imagine that in previous eras, when there was some technological shock, like the Neolithic Revolution, there may very well have been a dramatic increase in living standards for a brief period of time, like a couple hundred years, before the population increase occurred, which dissipated that. So, I mean, if we were to zoom out, is it possible that we're just experiencing a little blip and that we ultimately will revert back to lower living standards? Or do we have reason to believe that the population growth is flattened or shrunk in a permanent way?
Absolutely. If we think about human history and we think about a typical Malthusian fluctuation, this Malthusian fluctuation lasted for about 150 to 300 years. Sense that when technology arrived, it took population time to catch up and bring income per capita back to the previous equilibrium position. And the question that you ask is very relevant, namely, given the fact that 250 years passes the Industrial Revolution, is it possible that we are still within some possible Malthusian fluctuation? And my answer will be absolutely not. And the reason is that something very dramatic occurred in the course of the Industrial Revolution. As I said, the Industrial Revolution represented acceleration in technological progress, and this acceleration in technological progress changed the technological landscape in which people operated and required human capital, educated individuals that can navigate this stormy technological environment. And it is this investment in human capital, as I said earlier, that brought about the fertility decline and liberated the gains of productivity from the counterbalancing effect of population. So the fact that we have this dramatic shift in the regime, namely the fact that we started to invest in human capital, and as a result of it, our resources are not simply channeled towards the scale of the population, but towards the quality of the population, assures that, in fact, this is not a short-lasting phenomenon. This is a long-lasting phenomenon because, in fact, we separated the link between technology and population. As I said earlier, technological progress brought a proportional increase in population. It is no longer the case because this increase in resources are partly channeled towards the education of the population, and as a result of it, forcing individuals to have fewer number of children and preventing population growth from counterbalancing the effect of technology on human prosperity.
Well, I mean, it seems like the micro foundations of this theory involve parental investment, right? So parents have to choose between quality and quantity because the investment that they're making in their children's education is coming out of their own pocket. But a big part of the educational story that you tell is about the public provision of education. I mean, shouldn't the public provision of education sort of change the nature of that trade-off so that the parents are no longer required to invest as much individually and could sort of offload some of that education to the public sector? Or wouldn't that lead to the mitigation of this and potentially take us back to larger families? Why hasn't that happened?
Indeed. So when we think about investment in education, decisions that are made by parents, so parents naturally uh, are faced by certain resource constraint, and they have to allocate their resources between their own consumption, the number of children, and the investment in a child. Now, as you said, at a certain point, say in the course of the Industrial Revolution, when the demand for human capital is mounting, we see great lobbying activity by industrialists asking, in fact, the government to support educational reforms so as to allow the population to be educated. So indeed, some of the cost for educating children is carried by the government and is subsidized by the government in one way or another. But this is only part of the cost. Naturally, this is a time period in which child labor is very important, and as a result of it, sending children to school implies that parents are deprived from the output that will be generated due to child labor. But more broadly, I mean, education is costly, even if, in fact, public education is present. So we see very critically, we see very pronouncedly every country that experienced the demographic transition, the quantity-quality trade-off. We see it in the context of England, we see it in the context of Russia, we see it in the context of France, we see it in Spain, in Italy, in every place where empirical evidence were conducted or empirical analysis was conducted about the quantity-quality trade-off. We see very pronounced effect of the return to human capital on the increase in the investment in education and the decline in child quantity.
Well, you pointed to some evidence from the earliest part of the Industrial Revolution around demography, and you pointed out that if you invested more in the quality of your children, this might lead to a higher quantity of, say, grandchildren or great-grandchildren. I mean, it seems like that's probably no longer true, given that we're not living sort of on such a precarious frontier, right, with infectious diseases and so forth. I interviewed a demographer recently who said that the birth rates of folks like, Orthodox Jewish communities and other religious communities is far outpacing that of other communities. And indeed, they may sacrifice on education in exchange for quantity, but it doesn't seem like that trade-off ultimately results in a decrease in offspring further down the road. Has that math sort of ceased to work?
Okay, so that's an interesting. I mean, so when we think about the sort of the forces that brought about the transition from stagnation to growth, one can think about two separate mechanisms. One can think about the interaction between technological progress and the scale of the human population, and one can think about the interaction between technological progress and human adaptation. And if we think about a population that has basically certain variations in the predisposition toward child quality, some individuals prefer child quality more than others due to cultural reasons, due to religious predispositions, etc. Then what one can show historically is that, in fact, in those societies where the predisposition towards quality was higher, perhaps paradoxically, reproductive success in the very long run was higher than otherwise. Namely, despite the fact that you had fewer children due to the fact that you opted for higher quality children, these fewer children were more educated, were better nourished, and as a result of it, they lived longer, they married at higher proportions, and ultimately they had higher reproductive success relative to the alternative scenario. So in this respect, one can argue that in the course of human evolution, it is the case that over time, individuals with greater predisposition towards child quality generated an evolutionary advantage and became more and more prevalent in the society. But this evolutionary process will stop, as he suggested correctly, at the time of the demographic transition. Because at the moment that we see a negative relationship between income and reproductive success, at the moment that, in fact, the subsistence consumption constraint is no longer binding, those individuals that have greater predisposition towards quantity, say Orthodox Jews, will ultimately dominate the population because they will have a higher number of children. And in a world where reproductive success is not linked necessarily to the quality of the children, will have higher reproductive success, even in the very long run.
Right, because it does seem like the highly educated people in today's world are having fewer and fewer children to the point where they are no longer reproducing themselves, right? In most of the advanced economies, the fertility rate seems to have dropped below replacement.
Indeed. 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 So if we think about sort of differential strategies, a quantity strategy and a quality strategy, as I said earlier, it will be the case that the quality strategy will have the upper hand in the Malthusian epoch and in the post-Malthusian regime, just till the demographic transition. But once the demographic transition is taking place, in fact, it is the quantity strategy that will prevail, and ultimately individuals that have greater predisposition towards the number of children will be the dominating types, cultures in the population.
Well, do you think that that demographic constraint could lead to a slowdown in the rate of growth? Um, I mean, the growth that is built on human capital seems to benefit from an expansion of the interconnected community of thinkers, right? Who are exchanging ideas and trying out different approaches. I mean, if the population were to shrink, would that sort of arrest the positive feedback mechanism that you describe in the book?
Yes. So, in fact, the prediction of this type of models is that the initial selection process, the initial evolutionary process, will contribute to the transition from stagnation to growth because it will select traits that are complementary to the growth process, whether it is investment in human capital or long term orientation or elements along these lines. But ultimately, once the takeoff is taking place and once the demographic transition is taking place, this process will be unraveled. The composition of the human population will gradually shift. And as a result of it, the growth trajectory will be not as pronounced as it could have been otherwise. It's not the case that economic growth will come to a stop due to the changes in the composition, because the reward to human capital is so large that even individuals that are adhering to the quantity strategy would find it beneficial to invest in education. But the investment in education will be less pronounced, and as a result of it, the feedback to the growth process will be less pronounced. So the predictions of these models is that there is a great virtue for the evolutionary process that occurs earlier. This is, in fact, some of the trigger for the transition from stagnation to growth. But once this transition is taking place, and once the demographic transition is taking place, there is a reversal in this evolutionary process. And this reversal is, in fact, truncating the potential for prosperity in human societies.
And now a lot of work has been done on institutions and looking at the impact of institutions on economic growth. Um, but it seems like some of the folks who focus on institutions think that you can cut and paste or drag and drop institutions from the successful economies into the less successful economies. I mean, to what extent can one do that, and to what extent is that require all sorts of other complementary conditions?
Right. So, an important insight of the journey of humanity is that given the link between initial conditions, whether they're geographical conditions or cultural conditions or otherwise, and the current inequality and current economic prosperity, in fact, we would like to design a policy that will mitigate inequality across the globe and will expedite the growth process. should not hope to have a universal policy that will fit all nations. Each nation is unique in terms of its geographical endowment and the impact of this geographical endowment on the growth process. And as a result of it, it will be the case that one will have to orchestrate a policy in a way that is respective of the different elements that evolve in this society over time. For instance, the interaction between cultural norms and institutions are critical, and as a result of it, it is not necessarily the case that inclusive institutions that can serve very well prosperous nations will necessarily serve well societies in the midst of the process of development, or at least will serve them well only if there are certain safeguards that are implemented at the same time. So as I said, one of the main insights of the journey of humanity is that, in fact, there is no universal policy that will fit all nations. In fact, the design of policy will have to be respective of the history of each nation, the geography of each nation, and the evolutionary processes that occur there and lend this society into its current position. Once we understand these processes, we can design policies that will foster economic development and will basically target societies in a differential way. I can give you some examples, and perhaps if we talk later about the role of diversity, this would be a very simple example to show how, in fact, different policies can expedite economic development in different corners of the world.
Well, I mean, the emphasis on path dependence in some ways is very discouraging, right? So I know some critics of Doug North said, if you want to have economic growth, choose a different history, right? I mean, it seems like there's a bit of determinism in this more nuanced analysis of growth.
So the question indeed is, given the fact that we see an incredible link between initial conditions and contemporary prosperity, the question is history a fate? And the view that I'm advancing in the journey of humanity is that, in fact, history is not a fate. By understanding the legacy of the past, by understanding how initial conditions that existed in the past affecting economic development today, we can design policies so as to mitigate inequality in a more pronounced fashion. So in fact, the way that I would like to view the world is very different. Yes, initial conditions mattered and they brought us into the current position. There was a certain lottery of nature that existed very long ago that brought about the divergence in the wealth of nations as we see it today. But despite this lottery of nations, history is not a fate. If we understand the legacy of this lottery of nature, we can counteract this legacy and ultimately bring prosperity for the globe as a whole.
Well, in the book, you highlight the complementarity between institutions and culture. And of course, if you believe in the complementarity, then it becomes a bit of a chicken and egg story, right? So is it the institutions that are ultimately constraining the path of cultural evolution, or is it the culture that's constraining the path of institutional evolution?
So naturally, there is a reinforcing interaction between the two, and one cannot necessarily identify the initial impetus for this reinforcing interaction. But when I think about institutions in general and their impact on economic development, so suppose if we think about this classification of institutions into inclusive institutions and extractive institutions, can we view this segmentation as exogenous? Can we view it as manna from heaven, or is it in fact a byproduct of the process of development? And the viewpoint that I'm advancing is that to a large extent, the nature of institutions is predicated on the environment that existed in the distant past. So, for instance, when we consider the Neolithic Revolution, as you mentioned earlier, occurred in the Fertile Crescent first, around 12,000 years ago. In the course of the Neolithic Revolution, we see a dramatic increase in population density. We see the emergence of cities, we see the emergence of states, and we see even the emergence of empires. Prior to the Neolithic Revolution, certainly there are no formal institutions, and perhaps not even informal. But the Neolithic Revolution and the increase in population density is generating the demand for institutions that will govern the behavior of individuals, will allow individuals to coordinate in the construction of public goods, and will protect property rights. So again, it is the transition to agriculture, the geographical endowment that brought about this transition to agriculture that is generating the demand for institutions. Institutions are emerging, and ultimately they persist over time, and they are a catalyst in the process of development. So the viewpoint that I'm advancing to a large extent, in the context of institutions, for instance, is that institutions, to a large extent, and there are some exceptions, of course, is not the primary force in the process of development. It is, in fact, a catalyst of the process once the process is in motion. If you think about a locomotive, a train that is currently in a standing position in a train station, institutions will not be the ones that will start the movement of the train. What will be the beginning of the movement of the train, as I said earlier, is the scale of the human population and its impact on technology and its impact in population that will bring about the rotation of these wheels of change. And once these wheels of change are rotating, better institutions or worse institutions can affect the pace of the movement, but are not the trigger of the movement per se. So again, to a large extent, when I view institutions, I view them as a byproduct of the process of development. And this will be true for cultural elements as well. Naturally, at a certain point, there are certain externalities in societies that people cannot fully internalize. And the society is forming some cultural norms that allow, again, individuals to coordinate and to act based on cumulative knowledge and cumulative wisdom that was generated in the course of the history of this group over time. And these cultural norms can feed into institutions. Institutions can cause some adaptations in cultural norms. But in terms of the hierarchy of factors, the way that I view the world is that if we think about inequality today, it is affected by deep-rooted factors, institutions and culture that are reinforcing one another, but underlying institutions and culture are geographical elements and human diversity that are affecting the nature of the institutions, the nature of cultural characteristics, and their interaction. So there are deep-rooted factors, and there are the ultimate factors, which I view as geography and human diversity.
Well, it's clear if people are going to invest in human capital, they have to believe that they will generate some return on this human capital. And so they have to believe that the institutions are going to allow for these income streams to occur, right? And so just like with physical capital, you have to hope that someone doesn't come along and take it away from you, right? Whether it be the government or some invader. And so does that mean that you have to have some confidence that the pace of technological change is, and the trajectory of technological change is somewhat predictable, so that one knows that this investment will generate a return?
Right. So when I mentioned earlier this interaction between population and technology, and investment of individuals in future technologies, then yes, I mean, if we think about this process and the reinforcing interaction the reinforcing interaction will be much more pronounced in places where property rights are secured. In the sense that you can, in fact, make sure that the return to your investment, whether it's investment in physical capital or investment in human capital or investment in technology, is properly secured. Now, the security of property rights can be in the context of the governing body of a particular society. So, if we live in an autocratic regime, and in fact, technological progress is administrated to a large extent by the scientists of the court, then it will be the case that technology and technological progress and the reward to technological progress will be secured by this ruler or by this a particular entity. The same will be true in the context of other forms of investment. So certainly when we think about this reinforcing interaction between population, technology, and human adaptation, the pace of this reinforcing interaction is going to be a function of the quality of the institutions. So otherwise, we would have expected that the place that would take off first in the world would be China, because they had an incredible size of population that should have fostered great technological progress, that should have supported more people, and ultimately should have resulted in an earlier takeoff. But what we see, in fact, is societies that are residing in Europe are the ones to take off first, suggesting that there are other elements that are affecting the pace of this interaction. And in the context of Europe, it is precisely the security of property rights. It's the openness to trade. It's the degree of diversity and the flow of ideas that permit the scientific revolution that is fostering ultimately the industrial revolution, elements that are missing to a large extent in China. So it's not only about the scale, it is how the scale and technology are interacting in different institutional environments and cultural.
But it seems like the conditions that would lead you to invest in physical capital that had long-term benefits are slightly different from the conditions that would lead you to invest in human capital, to the extent that human capital is mobile, right? So, if you invest in a factory and the regime seizes your factory, you're kind of out of luck. But if you invest in human capital and the regime changes, you can simply move to another location where you may be able to make use of that human capital. So, are there conditions that would favor the investment in human capital at the expense of physical capital, and is that something which is going to affect the trajectory of economic growth?
Right. So that's a fascinating observation. And in fact, when you think about, say, the history of the Jewish people, this is an important factor in the fact that the Jewish population historically was very educated in comparison to nearby populations. And part of it had to do with the fact that the Jewish population was subjected to certain type of regulations, certain type of restrictions, and from time to time was subjected to forced mobility. And as a result of it, investment in physical capital was not very profitable because you could not carry it with yourself. Investment in land was not necessarily profitable, but because, again, you were expelled from your land, and as a result of it, you would lose your investment. And consequently, investment in human capital became significantly more important over time. But the observation that you make that is more general, that if in fact we are confronted by institutions that are very limited in terms of their protection of property rights, then it provides societies with the incentive to invest predominantly more in human capital than physical capital. And ultimately, this may pay off given the importance of human capital in the course of economic growth. As I said, this was certainly, if you think about sort of the prosperity of the Jewish population, it is really capturing it very well in the sense that initially investment in human capital was based on some sort of capricious decisions by some sages that suggested that in fact children should be able to recite the Bible in front of the community by the age of 13. The legacy of it is, of course, the bar mitzvah that we have today. Initially, it was some sort of an initiation process. It didn't have any meaningful economic value, but over time, this diversion of investment towards human capital became very important, given the fact that human capital became such an instrumental factor of production in the urban sector and ultimately in the modern growth regime.
Well, I mean, you point to the fragmentation of Europe as a key factor in the emergence of growth in Europe. And I think, most people focus on that as a source of competition, uh, where governments were essentially trying to experiment with different ways of doing business so that they could outcompete each other. But another factor which you point to is migration. And so it wasn't just Jewish people, of course. I have ancestors who were Huguenots, and they fled France and moved to Ireland. And so, to what extent does the mobility of people lead to greater diversity in the target communities and therefore lead to economic growth? You have a big emphasis on diversity as a source of progress. I wonder if you could dig into that and maybe highlight how you measure diversity, because there are a lot of different definitions of diversity, some of which seem to make a difference and some of which do not.
Right. So it turns out that diversity is a very important force in economic development. And in fact, diversity has conflicting implications for economic prosperity. On the one hand, diverse societies tend to be less cohesive. Diverse population tend to suffer from lack of trust. Diverse population have disagreement about the desirable public goods and policies. Some would like left-wing policies, other right-wing policies. And as a result of it, diverse population tend to suffer from conflicts, and they operate within the production possibility frontier, within the production capability of the society. But on the other hand, diversity fosters innovation. Diversity is associated with cross-fertilization of ideas. Diversity is associated with complementarities of different skills in the production process. And as a result of it, it's conducive for innovations and for adaptability. And consequently, it pushes the production possibility frontier outward. So in light of these two conflicting implications, it suggests to us that there is a level of diversity, an intermediate level of diversity that is conducive for economic development. Societies that are overly homogeneous or societies that are overly diverse will not function as well as societies that have an intermediate level of development. This is due to the fact that there are positive and diminishing effects of diversity on innovations and positive and diminishing effects of homogeneity on social cohesiveness. And as a result of it, there is a sweet spot level of diversity that is conducive for development. Now, it turns out that this sweet spot level of diversity has changed in the course of human history. And that's not surprising, because in early stages of development, the pace of technological progress is not very rapid. And as a result of it, the benefits of diversity in the context of innovations or adaptability is secondary. But as we move into the modern world, diversity becomes increasingly more important because the technological environment is very challenging and innovations are very rewarding, and adaptability to a rapidly changing technological environment becomes very rapid. So what we see historically is that, say, around the Middle Ages, societies that had the optimal level of diversity were societies such as Japan, China, and Korea. These are relatively homogeneous societies, but these are the societies that balance well between the virtues of homogeneity in terms of social cohesiveness and the virtues of some diversity in the context of innovativeness. But as we move into the modern world, or as we move into the eve of the Industrial Revolution, a place like Europe that is significantly more diverse had the upper hand because, again, this was a time period in which there was a need for, there was a need for great adaptability to the changing technological environment, and societies, the European societies and ultimately the United States, had the optimal mixture of society that permitted the adaptation to this rapidly changing technological environment. So overall, what we see is that diversity is an incredible force in the context of economic development. Based on our estimates, it accounts for about 1/6 of the variations in inequality across the globe today. And much of the variations in the diversity as we see it across the globe today was determined very much in the distant past. It was determined during the exodus of humans from Africa in a time in which humans started to populate a planet Earth as a whole.
But how do you measure diversity? I mean, genetically, Irish people and Iranian people are probably more similar than, Yoruba and Igbo, right? So is it genetic diversity? Is it cultural diversity? Is it um, uh, value diversity, skill diversity? What's the relevant metric for diversity here?
Okay, so the concepts I'm defining in assessing the impact of diversity on economic development is a concept that I defined as population diversity. And population diversity can take different forms. It can be cultural diversity, it can be linguistic diversity, it can be phenotypic diversity, it can be genetic diversity. Now, the way that we measure it, in order to assure that we can separate correlation from causation, is based on migratory distances from Africa. So we basically project diversity to each society in the world today based on migratory distance from Africa. And why is it so? Because we know that during the migration of humans from Africa, departing population carried with them only a subset of the diversity that existed in the parental population. And the further people migrated, the lower was the degree of diversity. So, say, indigenous people in Latin America are significantly more homogeneous than indigenous population in Africa. And consequently, we can use this migratory distance from Africa to predict diversity. And this would be a good prediction for, as I said, phenotypic diversity, cultural diversity, linguistic diversity, and genetic diversity. It's a universal measure that is predicting the degree of diversity, and as a result of it, is immune from potential reverse causality, namely the effect of prosperity on diversity. So suppose that I look at the world in the year one, and I basically focus on a place like Rome. And I ask myself, can I see the relationship between diversity and prosperity? Rome is quite diverse. It has the native population, it has slave population, it has migrants from other places. But is it the diversity that brought about the prosperity, or is it the prosperity that permitted people or attracted people into the place, either forcefully or otherwise? And in order to avoid this issue of potential reverse causality, we are predicting diversity to Rome, okay, based on migratory distance from Africa. And we ask ourselves, is it the case that this prediction is allowing us to see the impact of diversity on economic development? And what we conclude, as I said before, is that the diversity will have an hump-shaped effect on economic development. Societies with an intermediate level of diversity will have the upper hand in comparison to societies that are either overly homogeneous or overly diverse.
Well, Oded, thank you so much for joining me. The book, Journey to Humanity, is indeed a fascinating read. You comment on culture, institutions, diversity, all within a very, very short package. And I think most people, when they finish the book, are wishing it was longer. So thank you so much. I wish this conversation was longer, but hopefully we'll maybe have a chance to do it again sometime soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.